Right, by far and away the hardest part of approaches, I would say this. This requires you to understand all of the approaches, to know them in great detail, and to be able to compare them to each other. Compare and contrast, and I suppose draw some conclusions really about which one is best in particular situations. So comparison of approaches. So the approaches obviously we're going to be looking at are the six that we have studied. So they're in no particular order, these guys. Obviously you recognize Carl Rogers up at the top there, who is our humanistic guy, and you've got B.F. Skinner, behaviorism, in the top middle. You've got Sigmund Freud, psychodynamic, Charles Darwin down at the bottom left-hand corner there, Albert Bandura, sorry, Charles Darwin, obviously biological, Albert Bandura, social learning theory, and then you've got Aaron Beck, who is our cognitive guy there. Okay, so we're going to look at these different approaches and, like I say, compare and contrast them. So the way that we go about comparing and contrasting these psychological approaches is by looking at them using 5 different measures, really. So what does each of them say in terms of development? So what does the humanistic approach say about how that humans develop across their lifespan compared to how the psychodynamic does, for instance? What do they say about nature versus nurture? So what is the origin of behaviour? Is it nature? Is it our genes, our hormones, etc., or is it nurture? Is it a social feature of humans, or is it something in between? What do they say about reductionism? Okay, so when we're talking about reductionism, we're talking about whether we've got a holistic explanation or whether we've got a reductionist explanation. So is the explanation that each of the approaches produces, is it reductionist in nature, and if so, what type of reductionism is it? Or is it holistic? Does it actually look at the whole of human experience? Also as well, we need to determine whether this is a deterministic explanation. So is cognitive a deterministic explanation? If so, what type of determinism is it? If it's not, is it absolutely about free will? Okay, there's only one that's like that, isn't it? And the last one is its explanations and treatments of abnormal behaviour. So obviously these are the application side of things, aren't they? So if you have a particular approach, you believe in that, you think that's the way that humans work, then that will lead to a particular type of treatment. If we're looking at abnormal behaviours, they should lead back to the actual behaviour, shouldn't they, to the actual approach. So what do each of the approaches actually say about the treatments? Right, so we're going to start off with the learning approach, and we're going to look at behaviorism to start off with. Remember, the learning approach has got 2 different parts to it. There's behaviorism and there's the social learning theory. Behaviorism is obviously the work of John B. Watson, B.F. Skinner, more Edward Thorndike, etc. So let's just go down the different sort of aspects here of the approach and the what it actually says. So views on development. Well, within behaviorism, processes are continuous across the lifespan. Okay, so it's not saying that they occur in stages at any point. It just says that learning, which is what it's most interested in, just occurs if and when, right across the lifespan. In terms of nature versus nurture, well, according to behaviorism, behaviour is due to learned associations. Remember, this is classical conditioning, isn't it? And reinforcements, which is operant conditioning. So, that's not to do with nature. That's to do with the nurture. So it's to do. This is a very nurture-driven type of approach. Okay, so it's what's happening in your social sense rather than what genes you were born with. In terms of reductionism, probably the most reductionist of all of the explanations or the approaches really is behaviorism, in that behavior is massively reduced down to this stimulus response You are stimulated in some way, you respond, and that's tested in a lab setting. So that's highly reductionist. Okay, the type of determinism, now you can call this environmental determinism, should you want to, or hard determinism. Either one is absolutely fine. But according to the approach, all behaviour is environmentally determined. So there's nothing you can do about it, essentially. There's no free will involved here. A particular situation will cause a piece of learning in you, and you will act accordingly. That's some hard determinism for you. And in terms of the treatment of abnormal behaviour, well, we know, don't we, that behaviourism is used for things like phobia cures, that sort of thing. So behaviour therapy. So what happens there is that we unlearn faulty behaviour. Okay, so we unlearn these associations that we have formed. We unlearn the conditioned response that we have. Okay, so there's no sort of like large amount of discussion about people's childhoods or anything like that there. It is just simply about unlearning unhealthy behaviour. So social learning theory is the second model, the second approach in the learning theory area. And if we just look through some of these different aspects again, let's see what we've got then. So views on development then. So again, just like behaviorism, processes are continuous across the lifespan. Again, not a staged approach. It doesn't just happen at one particular stage and go in a particular predictable way. It just happens if and when across the lifespan. In terms of nature versus nurture, well, this is very much a nurture-driven idea again. Okay, so we have learned associations and we have these reinforcements, but remember the big difference between social learning theory and behaviorism is that there is observation and imitation of models. Okay, that the learning takes place as a result of these reinforcements, and it's not just simply down to classical and operant conditioning. There's a social element there to it as well. Reductionism wise, so do we have a situation where we have free will, or is it totally reductionist? Well, this is one of those ones which kind of starts getting a little bit into the middle ground, because whilst it is reductionist, as most of the learning approach is, it does take into account the idea of cognitive factors which serve as mediating influences. In other words, we have a choice about what we do, and that's really important. A big difference between that and just simple behaviorism. In terms of determinism, the way that social learning theory thinks about things is it talks about reciprocal determinism. This idea that actually we both influence and are influenced by our environment. So there's two factors at play there. Both of those factors will make an influence, will affect our behaviour, but it's not just simply a one-way street as behaviorism is. And the last little idea there is about explanation and treatment of abnormal behaviour. Well, again, if you believe in social learning theory, you would believe that you can unlearn unhelpful behaviour again. So things like modelling less aggressive behaviour or modelling more aggressive behaviour, depending on the situation that you're trying to address. Okay, the cognitive approach. Cognitive approach is one that students tend to find quite difficult, actually. But once we talk this through, hopefully it'll help you to get a better understanding of it and how it actually sits with other approaches. So in terms of development, this is where we have the first introduction of this stage theory. Okay, so a child will develop along a particular predictable set of stages. They're not the same stages that are talked about in the psychodynamic area. These are stages that come about by the work of Jean Piaget. We don't need to know what they are. We just need to know that there are stages of cognitive development. Okay. And remember, we have this idea of schema formation. Schema formation is a major part of what is happening in these stages, and they happen across the lifespan again, but in a predictable way. In terms of nature versus nurture, the cognitive approach is a little bit more on the nature side, shall we say. There is innate information processing. So we have this this ability, which is within our genes, to process information. Okay. However, we refine that information through experience. So you've got that little bit of an interaction going on, but much more nature than the previous approaches that we've looked at. In terms of reductionism, now this is an easy one, isn't it? We talk about this quite a lot. The cognitive approach has a information processing, or kind of like a computer analogy associated with it. It treats the brain and the mind and everything about us really as a bit like a computer, and as such completely ignores really the role of any sort of emotional sense that we have. That's called machine reductionism. In terms of determinism, then, we say that the cognitive approach has a soft determinism, because yes, there is an aspect here that we can choose our behaviours, okay, through the experience that we have. Okay, the degree to which we have free will is more limited than what we might imagine, though, according to this particular approach. But that's soft determinism. Again, that sort of bit in the middle, I guess you could say. And the last little bit, explanation of treatment. Well, if you believe in the cognitive approach, if you think that's the way that psychology can be best understood, then you would deal with cognitive ways of dealing with abnormality. So abnormality is caused, according to the cognitive approach, remember, OCD, etc., and what else was it? Depression as well. Faulty thinking at the source of the abnormality. Therefore, you would look at things like CBT, and I've just put there CBT, particularly for depression. Remember, CBT is all about trying to deal with faulty ways of thinking. Okay, so one of the last approaches that we looked at in terms of the evolution of approaches was the biological approach. So according to the biological approach, cognitive development and all other types of development, but the bit that we're interested in psychology is clearly cognitive development, controlled by genes alone. Right, so hopefully you're starting to see some issues here with this in terms of reductionism, etc. Straight away, nature versus nurture. The biological is the most nature-driven. This is a real nativist type of idea. It's all about our genes. They control our behaviour. Nothing to do with social experience or anything like that. It's all to do with our genes. In terms of reductionism, very, very reductionist. If you're trying to reduce down to just genes in terms of explaining people's behaviour, then it would seem to me that you're missing an awful lot out. So that is a very reductionist way of thinking. We call the type of determinism here, we call that genetic determinism, because it's only innate influences, there's nothing else. You can see how reductionism and determinism are kind of coming to the same conclusions here, aren't they? And of course, if you have a biological approach, then you would quite clearly think about biological ways of dealing with any abnormalities. So things like psychoactive drugs would be used in this particular approach. CBT, not so much. Psychodynamic counselling, no, not interested in that. Behaviour shaping, not interested in that either. It's all about restoring the balance, restoring the chemical imbalances in the brain which are causing the abnormalities according to the biological approach. Okay, so the two approaches that are just on the A level, okay, if you had done AS, you wouldn't have looked at these initially, but we just went straight through. This is the psychodynamic approach. And the psychodynamic approach, in terms of the history of psychology, I suppose it comes around about maybe even slightly before behaviorism, but around about the same time as behaviorism anyway. So What does it say? This is obviously the work of Sigmund Freud, and views on development wise again. So a theory that links process and concepts to age-related stages. Now remember, these stages are not the same ones that we talked about in the cognitive approach. These are your psychosexual stages in this particular approach. So development occurs along a predictable way along these stages, different ones to the cognitive as mentioned. Nature versus nurture. Lots and lots of innate biological drives, id, ego, superego, etc. However, there is still a degree of importance given to parental relationships and other relationships, but particularly parental relationships. So what you've got again is a little bit of both. Nature versus nurture, it sits somewhere in the middle. In terms of reductionism, it is a pretty reductionist type of idea, this, isn't it? That all our behaviour is driven by biological drives, innate biological drives. Personality is seen as a holistic interaction. Well, okay, it's holistic in that particular way, but it's still underpinned by these drives, which we can't really do much about, can we? And this is why we have the psychic determinism. Behaviour is driven by unconscious forces. It might be rationalised by the mind, but they're still there. So that is psychic determinism. Not a great deal of free will. Freud did talk about free will, didn't he? He said that free will was an illusion. So that's why we have psychic determinism. And the last one, explanation and treatment of abnormal behaviour. Well, unconscious conflicts and defence mechanisms are helped by psychoanalysis. So no drugs here, no psychoactive drugs. This is all about free association and about long-term counselling, help for people to understand what their repressed thoughts and ideas are. Psychoanalysis. And the very last one, this is our comparison of approaches slideshow, and we're looking at the humanistic approach. So humanistic approach is the last one, I guess, really. Not in terms of history, but it's the one that people tend to put to one side, really. They don't seem to consider it, but I'm quite glad that it's on the spec now, because it's an interesting one. Views on development anyway, ongoing development of self throughout a child's life. So again, you don't have this staged approach, you have this just idea, and these are the first approach that starts talking about the self and the self concept. So these are new terms in this particular area. Nature versus nurture. Parents, friends and wider society have a significant role in development. Remember the whole idea of introjected conditions of worth? That comes from nurture, but there is an idea that, you know, there are particular types of people who are more susceptible than others. So there is two issues in there, in parenting, etc. So there is a nature side to that as well. In terms of reductionism, right, well, the humanistic approach prides itself on being a holistic approach to human behaviour. It doesn't try to break things down into smaller units. It talks about the entire person acting together. And determinism, this is your free will one. So according to humanistic psychology, we act as active agents. We have free will over every choice that we make. And the last bit, explanation and treatment of abnormal behaviour. So this is the idea of person-centred counselling. I guess we could have put on there, based on Roger's ideas of closing the areas of incongruence, trying to get that gap between the self-concept and the ideal self reduced down, because it's that gap, that incongruence, which is causing the anxiety, okay, according to this approach. So just be aware as well that whilst those different approaches exist in their own right, there are some psychologists even, who like to combine the elements from different approaches because they think that they work well together, and we call that eclecticism. When you have, sometimes I've heard people talking about integrationists and that sort of thing, but eclecticism is what it says in the spec, so let's keep with that. Its approach, obviously, most modern psychologists are not interested in just putting themselves in one box. They want to actually look at different models and how they work in different situations. And the diathesis stress is a good example of this. You know, we've come across the diathesis stress model quite a few times, haven't we now? Schizophrenia, depression and OCD and all sorts of other things, really. And the idea behind that is there's an interaction between genes and the environment. It stands to reason, doesn't it? Combining the treatments makes for more effective outcomes for patients. Think about schizophrenia, psychoactive drugs plus CBT is much more effective than one or the other on their own. So this is an example of an essay that you might get in this area. So the question says, outline and compare any two approaches in psychology, and it's looking for 16 marks. Now the nice thing about this is that it's not asking you to evaluate in any way. It's simply asking you to AO1, give some information, some key information about a particular approach, then do that with another approach. So choose two approaches like it says here. That would be good to compare. You could choose cognitive and psychodynamic, and you could choose, I don't know, social learning theory and humanistic. Totally up to you, whatever you're happy with. Then give some AO1 details about those particular approaches, lots of key terms like I've said there. And then it's a simple case of using the 5 key areas to compare and contrast. So list down what they have in common and list down how they differ in terms of reductionism and determinism and all those 5 things that we talked about before. You should find that you've got a lot of things that you can write about, but you've got to be quite sort of specific. Make sure that you're not waffling away there. Lots of good key terms and using those particular areas that we've talked about previously. Now, I would suggest that it would be a good idea to have a go at this essay if you haven't done so already, because again, you can never really predict what comes up on exams, but I'd be very surprised if this doesn't come up at some point, whether as a 16 marker or an 8 marker, something like that. So I would definitely have a go at this because it's one of those ones that could get very easily missed out of your revision, and I think it's well worthwhile having a go at this particular essay. Obviously, any problems, anything you need to ask me about, just come and ask me and I'll be happy to answer them for you.